Cool. I like that intro. That was a much better intro than our previous intros.
It's a nice
uh,
intro.
yeah, welcome everybody. Folks are still rolling in. Thanks for joining. Fair warning, you might hear my kids this episode because they're here. They're in the building. But we're just rolling with it. I wanted to introduce Cameron Gardiner. Cam is a friend of mine from work, and for I guess a few years now,
Yeah, it's
we
been a
worked
couple of years.
together at Thinkful on some different programs. So Cam, just kind of introduce yourself a little bit, just kind of where you're from, what you're about, and then we'll get to talking.
Yeah. So I've been working at Thinkful for about 2 years now. I'm a senior admissions advisor now, but I've been working in admissions since we were like four people there. But
Hmm.
the reason that I joined Thinkful is a part of what I see as a larger life's mission to be able to give opportunities to people who wouldn't necessarily get them by themselves. And so Um, I'm really passionate about doing that in whatever way that I can. I come from Inglewood, California. So if anybody knows where the Great Western Forum is, where the Lakers used to play, I literally could walk down the street from there. Um, the Rams are actually going to be right next to where the Forum was. That's the city
Nice.
that I grew up in. I also grew up partly in Compton. Um, and Compton is notorious. If you don't know it, watch Straight Out of Compton and you'll know what
Right.
it's about.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did that. Went to Biola for a couple of years, finished my degree online, and yeah, now I'm just loving life and working.
Yeah, that it's interesting. I've never talked about this much on the podcast, but you talked about like one of the things that kind of keeps you drawn at Thinkful, and one of the things keeps me drawn is providing opportunities for people to like pivot their careers and
Yep.
really like create a new life and one that they can sustain themselves, things like that. That's exactly what drew me to Thinkful as well,
Yep.
because education wise in Arkansas is always like 10 years behind in tech. So it's like, and
Yeah.
they front like they're not, but they are. Let's just be honest. And
Yeah.
I remember sitting in the guidance counselor's office, and I had taught myself how to build websites in high school because the computer classes were like, this is a mouse and it moves like that. Like it was so basic.
If
And
you
so
right
like,
click.
yeah, you can see options, and it's like, okay,
Exactly.
I learned this when I was 5, like,
Hmm.
and so I remember her being like, well, what are you interested in? What do you want to do? And I was like, I'm super pumped about building websites, and I would love to like do that in life. And she was
Mm.
like, that's more of a hobby, not really a career. This is '06. This is
Ooh, look at her
'06.
now.
And so she was like, the closest thing would be like computer science if you go to college. So like you should go do that. I epically failed I got a 1.5 GPA my first semester in college in
All
my
right. All
computer
right.
science courses. Yeah, I went hard.
But
And
go.
I
You can
didn't,
go up.
and let's be clear, not because I partied. It was because I just sucked at C++ and it wasn't the same as HTML. Like
Yeah.
that is actually the story.
That's
And
tough.
got a psych degree and then made websites on the side for money in college. Like just like
Hmm. Already that guidance counselor is wrong. Just like,
yep. And so then one of like Courtney's in school. We have a newborn, Brody. This is 7 years ago now, and I'm
yeah.
having to like figure out how to make ends meet. And this ad pops up to be like, you should mentor at Thinkful as a web developer, and like that's how I got connected to it. And so like it not only like I kind of like fibbed a little bit just to like get my foot in the door to be a mentor,
Yeah.
but as soon as I did, I learned everything I needed to and was like sharing things with folks, and like I was like, this
Yeah.
mentoring thing's awesome. And I swore, man, I swore that I would like work full time. I would scrub the toilets with toothbrushes full time as long as I could work for Thinkful. And
That's
I
crazy.
finally got the opportunity to do something else than that, as be a program manager. And that's where you and I kind of got connected and everything. That's where the story comes to.
That's funny. Just a small
Yeah.
story on that. I heard about this guy he's the top closer for Tony Robbins.
Yeah.
He one day, I mean, he went to a Tony Robbins conference, and he one day decided he was going to work for Tony Robbins. He called 200 people within his organization to figure out how to get a job with him, and eventually got a job. So like, be persistent.
And now he's the top closer. Yeah.
No, he's brought in more money than anybody in history for Tony Robbins. So like hundreds of millions of dollars we're talking about. But if you're willing to make 200 calls to get the job, then I think you'll be solid once you get it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you're committed for sure. Yeah, it's a really I'd say it's like the most rewarding job ever, working at Thinkful, because it's like we see the end product, we see the passion at the beginning, but then we get to see the hard work and the grit that they put in, that the students put in, to then pivot their careers, and it's just game changing for them. Good times. Well, I wanted to talk today just about a lot of the social issues that are happening right now with the catalyst. I think there's a lot of different injustices that led to what we're seeing right now. I think it's right to say, though, that the catalyst for really what we're seeing is the George Floyd murder, an event, and like, I want to anchor on that. I know that there's many other like injustices and murders that are happening, all across the world, really. But I think something, and feel free to chime in and tell me if this is true for you as well, but like, something about George Floyd's murder, it left no doubt in anyone's mind. I don't care who I've looked at online, I've talked to, it left no doubt that was a murder, that it was an injustice. What is like your sense of that?
Yeah, so I think Will Smith said it really well, that racism hasn't changed or grown, it's just being recorded. And like, I personally haven't watched that video. I can't watch those videos after a long time. It's just too much. But from what I've heard about it, it's 9 minutes of him pleading for his life. At one point, he cries for his mom. And this is a grown, over 6 foot man whose life was taken in front of our eyes, and the whole world can see. There's no place that video is going to hide. And so I think this has been like a collection, or like a dissertation sort of, in the injustice of Black people sort of just building and building and building. And then like, I think, like you said, like sort of the powder keg that blew everything up was this murder, that like, even I think conservatives will say, like, or Fox News will say, like, this was a murder, he was a bad apple, not like, oh, well, what was he doing? That question hasn't been asked at all. And so, I agree with you there. It definitely was a very visceral, hard to watch murder.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I have actually seen a couple of folks talk about like, well, he was being asked to being detained because of forgery, but as soon as they say that, it's again, it's so like, every one of them follows up with, but there's no excuse. Even if he had murdered 1,000 people, there is no excuse for what happened to him on the streets of Minnesota. Like, it's just like, there's just no excuse for it. And so like, it does seem different. I mean, like, Courtney and I were talking just about like, hey, like, how do we talk to our own kids about this? It's something we haven't really answered, and that I'd love to kind of discuss here in a minute. But it's like, I think it's what we know is that we can't ignore something like this, and like, there has to be progress that comes from this. It can't stay stagnant. And I one of the things that I saw a pastor, he was a Black pastor, and he was talking about, look, what we're asking for is to not be tried and convicted and like sentenced in the streets and then murdered in the streets. Like, that's the justice. We want the justice system just like anyone else, no matter what that person has done. And that struck a chord with me. I like that. that kind of hit different about like putting it into perspective of what was happening and why people were reacting. What's kind of been like your sense around your circle and just your sphere of influence? Like what's
Yeah.
been
So I would say like what's most unique about this one, I think, is the mass amount of unsolicited support that I've seen from, I would honestly just say, a lot of white friends that I have. These sorts of things have been happening previously. Like you can go through down the list of names that everybody has seen on the news, and some people haven't, like Tamir Rice, Michael Brown,
Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin, yeah, that was I think the one that started the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yep.
Philando Castile, like all of these names we've seen in the news, but like when I was working online, that was not something where the whole world had to stop, sit with it, and have to say something about it. I feel like there's been a general ethos that silence really is violence here, where like you don't say anything, what is wrong with you? I think everybody gets a feeling now, and especially after the video came out and the protests were coming out, like when you were scrolling through your Facebook feed and people were just going around about their normal lives, like going to the grocery store and taking a picture of it, there was a bit of looking at people differently, like how could, like the whole world is burning right now, why are you talking about going to Walmart and buying
and fronting? Yeah,
exactly. And so like I think that's what I felt has been different in my circles. For the people, I mean, honestly, like for the Black people that I know, our reaction has actually been a little bit different, especially amongst the Black men that I talk to, where I think one of the first thing that comes up is numbness. Like, we've seen this before. This is something that I've been getting a talk about since Rodney King. Even when I was talking with my dad about it this last Saturday, he brought up Rodney King. Like, and he said it's the same shit. We've seen this consistently, and like we haven't seen significant like policy reform to where like numbers are going down. So like it's been weird because I feel like as the outrage has risen for this, a lot of the people who could most likely be the victim, like myself and other Black men, are just like, yeah, well, that's what happens. This is how it is. I mean, yes, we want it to change, but like we've seen it so consistently that for us, it's like, what else?
Well, it sounds like you've seen it so consistently, and so consistently have seen nothing change from it. Is what it sounds like. Tell me a little bit about like what was that talk that like your dad since Rodney King? Like, tell me a little bit about what that talk is.
Yeah, so I mean, unfortunately, it had to be on my my little brother's. Like we were celebrating his graduation this last Saturday. And the subject matter came up. I mean, we were with my sister, my wife, my younger brother, my dad, and me, all at a park, and he was just going around the table asking us like how we felt about it. And then, I mean, he was, I think, almost to the point moved to tears, where he's like, "I've seen this before." Like, I think he was talking about it in reference to him and my mom's marriage. Where they both, like, he remembers where he was when he heard about Rodney King. And he remember, oh yeah, that's what he said. He said that he said, hey, I think that this probably is going to get worse before it gets better, because it was OJ and then it was Rodney King, or vice versa. I'm not old enough to know the timeline on it. And there was this split between white and Black, because we had seen the tape with Rodney King. It was obvious, and the police officers got off. And then OJ came out, and if you were Black, you were like with OJ, and if you were white, you were outraged by what happened. But he's like, I've seen this happen so consistently. And I think the other thing that he lamented was how some of his white friends are reacting, where he just can't seem to get them to understand. I would say my dad is like way much more on the middle, where he wants unity in this whole situation. And so for him, it really breaks his heart when he sees, I mean, I think even just this week, he was posting about Jerry Falwell asking for forgiveness for retweeting a picture of the governor of Virginia in blackface. He said he shouldn't have done that and it was appropriate. And like he was saying thank you for Jerry Falwell apologizing and getting it from my auntie, who was like, why would you even thank this man for that? Like what he did was wrong. And so he was talking about, I mean, he had this balance and this skepticism that things will get worse because things are so out in the open now.
Do you think that like most of the public is like your dad, where they're more in the middle of like, yes, this is wrong, but they're also like able to recognize reconciliation as well? Like there's like a sentiment of like what you see in media, what you see on social media, especially, is like the two extremes, like one versus the other extreme. But I've seen a lot of people more where your dad is, it seems. Is that your same sentiment as well, just within your circle?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say even looking at, say, like my wife's brothers, like they're like, yeah, that, I mean, they refer to it as murder. They are watching Fox News all day. So for them, like this is like, for them to admit that is huge. I think that the division, I mean, I don't think the division comes even with what happened with George Floyd. I think most people say that that's murder. Very few people, I haven't met one person who said that he deserved it. Even I think the person who I have found most offensive in Candace Owens in this whole thing was like, what should have happened? I mean, what happened to him shouldn't have happened to him. I think that there's consensus around that. I think that where the divide comes is, what do we do from here? And what is the real issue? And I think that that's probably where there's going to continue to be divide and debates about what should be done about this. Because I think on one camp, we hear the like few bad apples. Like this is like, there are just cops out there who are racist. We need to weed them out so that our system can function as it should. And then there are people that are saying the whole system is bad. We need to rethink the whole thing. And that, I think, is where the biggest division is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I like reflecting on my own like history. So my biological father was one of the most corrupt policemen I think I've ever met. And so like I'm talking mobster shit, dude. Like I'm like crazy.
Training day.
People disappearing type stuff, right? So like,
wow,
there's that stuff. Yeah, there's like that side of it, and then I have my dad, who is technically my stepdad, but I grew up with. Yeah. He's a constable here in Arkansas and has served his community with such heart for decades, right? And so it's like, I see both ends of like the extreme there of like, there definitely are people that are corrupt, that have hate, and that is what they are about. And then I see people that have love and empathy for everyone and just want to protect and serve properly, not in a lot of the ways that we're seeing it. And so I have these like two sides that I pull from, and I'm like, I can see this. And so I almost like, I wonder what your thoughts are. Like one reaction that we've seen, right, is people being like, blue lives matter or all lives matter. And I think those reactions are missing the mark of what the truth and the message of the Black Lives Matter movement is really about. Can like talk to me a bit about what that true message is, and why that may be missing the mark there.
Yeah, so I watched a comedy and a comedian talk about this. I think that at its core, Black Lives Matter is not trying to say that Black lives matter more than anyone else's. I think that it starts from the place of Black people have been disproportionately targeted by police, by the system, by policies. And they've been done that targeting has led to the stripping of their freedom, the stripping of their opportunities, and the worst situations the stripping of their life. And so the Black Lives Matter movement is starting. I think you have to recognize and start from that place. If you don't, I mean, there's a whole history that I feel like a lot of people are not educated on those things that I just said right now. Like for a lot of people, equality started once the slaves were freed, or even more, like equality started once Black people got the right to vote, after Martin Luther King. And then it was up to every man himself to pull himself by his own bootstraps and to get it done. But Black Lives Matter speaks into a whole history of a system that has made it harder for Black people to excel, especially from disadvantaged communities. And so it starts at that place. And then once you recognize that, and if you get to the point where you can recognize that, then it becomes a lot easier to recognize, okay, Black Lives Matter, because while they have been targeted and stripped and looted in this way, they matter just as much as everyone else's. And so like when you're saying all lives matter and blue lives matter, I think like the best analogy is like, I can't give you an analogy off the top of my head. I'll think about that later.
I've heard one. I'll tell you one that I've heard, and you can tell me like if you think that this is accurate.
Yeah.
Like I saw this kind of like skit on TikTok that was like, oh my God, this person's house is on fire. Like, let's all go help put it out. And then like this person decides like, well, my house matters too. And it's like, okay, is your house burning to the ground?
Yeah.
Well, no, but it matters. And it's like, okay, but their house is on fire. Like we should go take care of this. And so I thought that felt like a pretty accurate representation. In terms of the history that you're talking about, I can tell you I don't, and I've begun, I would say over the last 2 years is really when I've begun to start educating myself. And I know some people listening may be like, what is it? Like, I need concrete examples of this. And I think two that really, really stand out to me is Nixon's cabinet, one of his cabinet members talking about how they push drugs into these disadvantaged communities and push Black people towards these disadvantaged communities to keep them at bay, to not vote, to keep them from their rights. Like that was intentionally done to keep Black Americans from gaining anything within the system that's been created. Like that is the system that I think you're referring to in terms of that's been created.
I think the biggest thing that I would say, like the punchiest one that I have from that can help people to recognize this, is that there are more people in prison today who aren't making a living wage and who have been stripped of their freedom for nonviolent drug offenses than there were slaves back in slavery time. Like astronomically more people. And that is not because there are a million more criminals. Like I said, it's for nonviolent drug offenses that we have now legalized, by the way. Marijuana was huge for sending people to prison. It's like, oh, never mind. We're not going to do that anymore. But people have lost their whole lives over this. And they basically are working in slave labor as a result. And that was done by design. That was not something that was,
which is something that people have admitted to nowadays. Like we have tapes, we have actual recordings of them talking about setting up this system, right? Like, it's not a fabrication of someone's mind or anything. There's hard evidence, and also there's like you and I being data guys, like there is statistical evidence, and I have the numbers right here, and like the Black community is charged and convicted of what was it? Is they were arrested 3 times more per capita than the white community, and that was across all the different types. So like if people are like, well, it's equal, and they'll use numbers, and it's like, no, you got to use per capita. and per capita,
Yep.
the Black community is arrested 3 times more, 2.8 to be exact.
Yeah.
And so it's like statistically, this is a problem. The data, there's evidence.
And then there are a few things with that. I know that immediately in people's minds, it's like, oh, well, criminals are criminals. They're just being arrested because they're committing more crimes. But if you look at where police are centered and where they were sent, especially during the war on drugs, there were 2 types of like cocaine. There was the crack cocaine, and then there was the powder cocaine. And
the lights went off. Sorry. give me Alexa, turn on all office lights. This happens every time. You'd think I'd remember to keep my lights on. Anyway, go ahead. There was the regular cocaine and there was crack cocaine.
So the one that the rich white boys were using in very affluent neighborhoods, the police weren't sent there. The police were sent to the poorer neighborhoods where sometimes, and I think a lot of the times, the crack was being put there by the government. So again, this was a calculated, well thought out like way. And I mean, like, and that's just a part of it. Like, we're not even talking about automation and how that's affected the inner city. My favorite book on the whole subject of why the inner city is the way that it is called When Work Disappears by William Julius Wilson. He was a scholar. He's a Harvard educated scholar. And his whole thesis is that during the area of Ronald Reagan, when work got outsourced to China, through a whole bunch of society crumbled because of that. And I mean, even if you look at like just economic numbers today, when unemployment drops below a certain rate, people literally start dying at a higher rate. So like already we've just covered mass incarceration, which is one thing, and then we're not even dealing with like how jobs were outsourced and what that did to the inner city. These are these huge systematic issues that made you much times more likely to not succeed if you were born in Compton as opposed if you were born in Westchester.
Yeah, I think that's the type of education that, like I said, personally, I've just myself done over the last couple of years that like I think is important context that everyone should have going into the conversation of like, how do we actually move the ball forward? How do we actually create progress out of all of this? And I think stepping back and looking at the macro of it, you know, going back to like, you said everything's just being recorded. And like, I think what we're seeing, one thing that I love about the internet is that transparency always wins. And I think what we're seeing at a very macro level is that transparency and empathy are causing friction with the people that have kind of hid out in the system and have hate and are corrupt. And there's just no place for it anymore. Like like this is true in life. This is true in business. Like you can no longer, like it was very easy in the 80s. It was very easy to be one way in front of your business partners and another way in front of your wife and kids or your friends. And like you could play the game really well. I think nowadays it's very difficult because everything's being recorded and everything and it's sniffing out the people that are corrupt and are hateful. And I like that. And so I think what we're seeing here is empathy and kindness are winning. And that is right. And that's why I think that's why I really believe that being silent is unacceptable in this time. Because when I think about my great granddaughter and her having the ability to see my tweets, to see my Instagram posts, to see my podcast or whatever, it's not going away. She's going to know what I said and how I said it and what my intent was. And it's the right thing to do is always the right thing to do. And I think that that's where a lot of people are starting to get to. And it is sad that for so many years, decades, that a lot of the Black community has just felt numb now because they've just seen it time and time again. And so
Yeah.
that does hurt. But I think at the end of the day, we're seeing empathy and kindness win.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's interesting about this, people don't know this, but people talk trash about the news and the media all the time. But one of the biggest weapons that the civil rights movement actively sought out and used was the media. Things like terms that we know, like Bloody Sunday, or if you look at I think it was Bloody Sunday on Selma. The tactical plan for the civil rights movement was, we want to bring out the aggressiveness and the ugliness of racism, and we want that on camera.
Yeah.
So they, in some sense, were trying to provoke a very nasty response from law enforcement. Bull Connor, who was one of the most racist governors during the civil rights movement, was gold for the civil rights movement because they could get it on media where people could act like segregation was this nice, polite thing. Like, even if you listen to it, right? Separate but equal. It sounds almost like utopia, right? But when you have a picture of a person getting mauled by a dog, people against a wall with a water hose that's being blasted at them full power, that looks a little different than like the little utopic vision that you get for separate but equal. And I think fast forward to today, Twitter, Facebook, all of those resources have it so that, like, when tear gas is being used on protesters who haven't done anything, you can see it immediately. It's the same tool that I think is being consciously used. And it's genius to get people to be like you said, to become empathetic, because King used to say, what we need to do is get those Leave It to Beaver people who are living their lives and want things to just be polite and well to see Bloody Sunday. Then that person is going to get up and do something. Then that person is going to say, no, what we're doing is wrong. And I think that when you see a horrific murder of George Floyd for 9 minutes straight, and there's nothing that you can say about it, then some things are going to have to change.
Yep. Yeah. And I think one of the worst things, I did happen to see the video, and I think one of the worst things was after he had already passed away, the crowd around him, 2 individuals were saying, like, hey, he's not breathing, like he's not moving. Why is your knee still on his neck? And like, it just goes to show that there is still the systemic problem, and it takes everyone to fix that kind of problem. Like, it doesn't happen by just a few people. It's an entire mind shift for all people, and I wonder how that plays out in other countries as well. Like, we're really talking mostly about the American country here, like a U.S. country. I'm really curious to see how this affects things around the world, because I think it's going to take a worldwide shift almost as well. But I think one of the things, and people think that can seem daunting, and when I think about, like, what are some of the steps to take forward, I think the people in your sphere, the people in your circle, that everyone can make a change there, right? And like, first within yourself, I think that's got to be the first thing. First within yourself, then within the people around you, and standing up for even, like, kind of like these minor aggressions that you may hear, things like that, of saying, like, no, that's not how we should think about this. It's not. And so I'm curious to kind of, like, get into the conversation of, like, what are some of the things that we can start doing to see progress and from everything that's going on right now.
So I mean, I think the first thing is something that you've mentioned a few times, is being educated. Systematic racism is a term that's easy to latch onto and not understand. When I say systematic racism, have very specific structures that are in place that work In the same way that like a sales funnel or a company funnel works, systematic racism is built for certain people to go this way who are disadvantaged and who look this way, and other people who look a certain way to go another way. Figuring out like that problem and seeing it, I think, is huge. Then I think is coming with a disposition of empathy and wanting to listen to your Black friends and genuinely wanting to listen. Like, I mean, and this is something that we all have to work on. Just yesterday, my wife, who I think is an incredible ally, I come into the room last night and I come to her and I'm like, CNN just put up this article, breaking news: the Confederate flag is no longer going to be allowed at NASCAR. And she's like, oh, my heart, the world is changing. And I'm like, no, how is the Confederate flag ever able to fly at NASCAR? And she was like, wow, I just had to check my privilege and think about that for a second. And this is something that I think we're all going to have to work out together. We're all going to have grace and to listen to one another together on. But it's really, really easy to not change anything in this case, because when something is built in the system and a funnel is built, making a completely different one means scratching what you already have, and means coming up with new that you may not have ever thought of before. And that's scary and that's hard and that's difficult. But I think that if we have that disposition of empathy and love for one another, we can get there. And I think also having peace with one another. Man.
Oh, I lost you. You there? Devin, can you hear him? Gotcha. Hold on, folks. We'll get Cam back in just a moment. Oh no, his internet went out. We'll hold tight.
Oh,
hey, you're back.
Hey.
There we go. So where we left off was you were saying like how was the Confederate flag ever able to fly? That was kind of where we started losing you.
Yeah, for sure. So I think having a disposition of empathy and listening on both sides, but I think also validating a rage and a desire for a whole system to change, because changing a system is hard. Imagine how hard it is for you to change a habit on a day-to-day basis. Like a habit that you really like, that you really like and you really enjoy, or one that you're comfortable with, not even one that you enjoy, just like you enjoy. Take that and imagine how hard it is to change that with two people in your relationship with your spouse or a person that you know.
Yeah.
That is extremely hard for any couple to change something about themselves that they normally do. Now take that and magnify that by your city and then your country. That is what we're up against when we're talking about changing something like systematic racism. And it's something that has been at the root of American history and has continued on to this day and morphed and looks different in a different way today. And so thinking that having a few conversations with Black people and listening to them in a good way, and that's a good thing. That is a great start. This will extend past your lifetime so far as it being a problem, I think. I think the other thing is not putting, I mean, figuring out the exact way that you can be an ally, because we all have lives to live. Not everybody's going to be an activist. Not everybody's going to devote their lives to fixing this in some way or another. I particularly want to solve the unemployment problem. I think that that's a huge issue that, if solved, is going to solve a lot of problems that we see in the inner city, and that's not even going to be solved in my lifetime. But figuring out exactly where you fit in and doing that to the best of your ability, I think will help you to contribute to something long term.
So, I mean, I told you a bit about like this podcast is I want this podcast to be a generational resource. We talked about that a little bit. And so like, when I think about that context, like, I would love to hear your thoughts on one, like Courtney and I have been talking, like, okay, how do we talk to our kids, and like, when's the right time? Like, you know, our kids are 7 and 3. And so like, it's like, like, how do we like actually make sure that we're like passing down right information and the right mindset and everything else, and then to their kids and to their kids, and like in perpetuity. What are some ways, just thoughts that you have around that?
Yeah, well, I think pairing it with how you respond on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I think your kids are probably watching you as much as they're listening to you. So like, by doing this, you've immediately taken a step and said, this is one way that I'm contributing to this. This is one where I'm saying, no, not with me, not in my house. And then when they grow up and they watch this, they'll know, yeah, my dad was on the side of justice. And then I think having those conversations, a lot of these things are complicated and hard, but they're also really simple. People are created in the image of God and need to be respected as such, even someone who's a criminal. And when they see something like what happened with George Floyd, because it's going to come up, I don't think that anyone can avoid that. I think starting with that foundation is going to help. And then I think helping kids to think systematically about issues is so important, because all we see on a day-to-day basis is what I do produces results, and it's really easy to get caught into the trap of what everyone else does should be producing their own results. But whenever kids get smart enough to understand how systems work and how they can be both good and empowering and how they can be bad, I think growing up with that understanding is really going to help them to frame this type of conversation for the future. Because I think one of the biggest problems when it comes to something like racism is that so many people see a guy in a hooded t-shirt with the 2 eyes cut out and see him saying the N-word with the ER, and just like wanting to lynch Black people all day long, when the much more visceral idea is having an invisible set of cultural habits that are meant to disadvantage people. And like that, it's going to take a lot of re-education for the normal person to get that. So starting with your kids on a day-to-day basis on that, I think, is important.
Yeah, I mean, one, kids are definitely like mirrors, I think, a lot of times, where like I have a habit of cussing, right? And so like all of a sudden my son says a cuss word, and then I get to look from Courtney like, all right, tighten it up. And so like I think they're mirrors of what they've seen in their household. And I did the other day, I was like looking at a news article, and he was seeing the protests, and he it was like a video, and he was watching, and he's like, what are they doing? And like, it was a moment in time where I thought, okay, I can either like progress things, or I can just like sweep it under the rug, you know? Like, I think there's little moments like that come out of nowhere. They typically will catch you off guard, where you have a decision to make. And I think just being more conscious of that and saying, okay, how can I just progress things a little bit further? How can I instill in the next generation to do a little bit better? And so we talked about like, well, these people are upset because there was a bad police officer who had hate in his heart, and he killed a man that in the streets, and did not allow him to go through the justice system. And he took that person's life, and with like, it was an injustice. And at 7, it was a little, I don't think that he necessarily internalized everything, but I said, but these people are standing up and saying like, this is the right thing, like, that shouldn't happen again. And he goes, well, why were they mad? Or why did he kill that person? And I said, well, because some people hate people just because their skin is a different color than someone else's. Yeah. And he looked at me the most confused look of like, what? Like he couldn't like comprehend that. And I was like, that's not nice, is it? And he was like, no. Like it was just like a given thing. And I'm reminded of it, just like, this is something that's taught. Like this type of like racism is not something that is inherent to human beings when they are born. Like this is a learned behavior that, like you said, is a pattern that has to be broken. And I mean, I have a psychology degree. You talked about breaking habits and like creating a new system, and how like just within Courtney and I's marriage, I know, right? Like I had habits when I got married that just weren't great for us. And so 10 years later, I'm still working on things myself, and she's still working. And so like, that makes so much sense, that analogy for creating a new system. And I think that everyone should just be more self-aware and more conscious of those micro moments where you can move the ball forward, create progress, instead of just keeping it under the rug or something of that nature.
Yeah. And I think one thing I would add to that too is like, I personally, and I think a lot of people that are listening to this believe that Martin Luther King said it eloquently, that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Like every little thing that you do is saying yes to life and is bending towards the way that the universe is supposed to be. So these are big problems that no one person can solve, but by doing your little part and your big part, because some people have the capability and the power to do more. Do more, and some people should do more, should be challenged to do more. All of those decisions are bending towards, I think, a reality that says this is the right thing to do. This is where humanity is headed as a whole.
Yep, I agree. And I think the internet is such a great equalizer in a lot of different ways into making things more transparent.
Very valuable.
Well, man, I really appreciate you hopping on. This has been an amazing conversation. I know I just kind of like asked you out of the blue a few days ago, and you were like, yeah, let's chat. So I appreciate you coming on. I'd love to like have you come on again, maybe in a year, and just kind of like make this a yearly thing where we just chat. I think it would be great. Cool. Thanks for hopping on. And I guess I'll see you tomorrow. Talk every other day. So. Cool, man. Talk to you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.